Homeostasis is one of the major themes of physiology. The basic idea is that the internal environment of the body is maintained relatively constant. This idea comes originally from a French physician, Claude Bernard. He did studies in the mid-1800s, and what he noted was that body temperature, heart rate, blood pressure, various properties of the blood were all fairly constant. And so these were the initial studies that gave rise to this idea of homeostasis. So basically, and he also postulated that this constant internal environment was a condition for a free and independent life. So in other words, people are able to move around the world, colonize different parts of the world. Animals are able to move into different environments based on the fact that they can keep this internal environment relatively constant. An example would be humans can live in very hot environments, they can live in very cold environments, and yet they maintain a core body temperature of about 37 degrees centigrade or Celsius, no matter where they are. So someone on a tropical island would have a body temperature of 37 degrees Celsius, and so would an Eskimo. And it really, the external temperature can be very different, yet they have the same body temperature. And so basically the idea is that the cells of your body work best at this temperature, and therefore your body does everything possible to maintain this relatively constant core body temperature. Okay, so then this idea of homeostasis was further developed in 1929. An American physiologist named Walter Cannon created the word homeostasis to describe the regulation of the body's internal environment. He explained that he selected the prefix homeo, which means like or similar, rather than homo, meaning the same, because the internal environment is maintained within a range of values rather than an exact fixed value. He also pointed out that the suffix stasis in this instance means condition, not a state that is static or unchanging. So Cannon's homeostasis, therefore, is a state of maintaining a similar condition. So this is very similar to Claude Bernard's relatively constant internal environment. And one of the things that Walter Cannon did also was he started to, not only did he state there's a similar condition, this homeostasis, but he also looked into the mechanisms in greater detail than had been done previously. Okay, so let's look at examples here. So if the body fails to maintain homeostasis of the critical variables listed by Walter Cannon, the normal function is disrupted and a disease state or pathological condition may result. So pathological comes from the idea of the word pathos, which means suffering. And diseases fall into two general groups according to their origin: those in which the problems arise from the internal failure of some abnormal physiological process, and those that originate from an outside source. So for example, here if we look at this picture, we have an organism in homeostasis. There could be an external change. Alternatively, there can be some sort of internal change. Either way, there can be a loss of homeostasis momentarily. The organism then attempts to compensate. Luckily, compensation usually succeeds and the animal continues to survive. But of course, it's possible that compensation may fail, and then you could fall into a disease, or illness, or disease state. So one common condition we'll come back to over and over again is the pathological condition called diabetes mellitus. This is a metabolic disorder characterized by an abnormally high blood glucose concentration. And there's actually quite a few different types of diabetes mellitus. It's a whole family of diseases with various causes and manifestations. So again, you could think of it to be as a type of failure of homeostasis. Normally, blood glucose concentrations are regulated within a very normal range. Your blood glucose concentration will increase tremendously immediately after a meal. And then after a meal, as your cells of your body take up the glucose, then the glucose concentrations fall, and your body actually then releases glucose from the liver to maintain the blood glucose concentration at a relatively stable value. With diabetes, when a person has a meal that's high in sugar content, the blood glucose levels can reach very high levels. It can be damaging. And we'll talk more about diabetes in the future. Okay, so homeostasis is the maintenance of a relatively stable internal environment. And why do we need to do this? Well, most of the cells in our bodies are not very tolerant of changes in their surroundings. So this is in contrast to, say, an amoeba or some sort of single-celled organism that can really tolerate a wide range of temperature and salinity and things like that. Our cells are not tolerant at all to changes in temperature, salinity, pH. So in a sense, they're sort of coddled. They're spoiled in a sense. They're only going to accept a very small range of values. Okay, so for multicellular animals, the internal environment of the body is the watery internal environment that surrounds the cells. This is called the extracellular fluid, or ECF. Extra, of course, means outside of. This extracellular fluid serves as a buffer zone between the organism's external environment and the intracellular fluid, or ICF. Intra meaning within. So again, if we go back to the example of an Eskimo, it could be extremely cold outside, yet the they're wearing appropriate clothing, and then the body of this Eskimo is generating a lot of heat, and so that maintains their body temperature. And so their blood would be at, at roughly 37 degrees centigrade. And this would keep the organs of the body happy and healthy, as well as the cells within the body in a healthy state. Okay. So homeostasis involves elaborate physiological processes that have evolved to keep the ECF composition relatively stable. So this is really the origin of the idea of homeostasis, is looking at the ECF properties of the extracellular fluid. Its temperature, its salinity, its pH, its osmotic concentration, and so forth. There, of course, are other types of homeostasis, but originally this is what the idea of homeostasis was derived from, was looking at these measurements. But now we've extended homeostasis, and we can talk about homeostasis at the cellular level also. Mostly in this course we'll stick fairly closely to the original idea of homeostasis, which is looking at maintaining the ECF composition relatively stable. Okay, so we'll talk a lot about compensatory mechanisms in this class. When the ECF composition varies outside of its normal range, compensatory mechanisms activate and try to return the fluid to a normal state. For example, if you drink a large volume of water, the dilution of your ECF triggers a mechanism that causes your kidneys to remove excess water and protect your cells from swelling. So again, most of the cells in multicellular animals do not tolerate much change. They depend on constancy of the external fluid to maintain normal function. Here's a picture from your book. There's a couple ways of representing this. You can have here, for example, a cell. There's the external environment out here, and then there's the ECF. And so you can see the ECF does serve as a kind of buffer for the cells of your body. Most of your cells are not in direct contact with the external environment. Another way of representing this is with this box diagram, which is actually very useful. So you have an external environment. You can imagine, for example, a fish swimming around, and it has a certain concentration of, say, potassium in the water that it's swimming in. You then have the extracellular fluid. It would have a certain concentration of potassium. That's going to be different from that of the water the fish is swimming in. And then finally, the ICF, or intracellular fluid, would have yet another concentration of potassium, so it would be different. And so your body would be regulating things like ion constant distributions and concentrations and so forth very tightly in order to maintain life. Okay, so that's it for the basic idea of homeostasis.